We move into the 7th panel of Urban Arc, which is titled Translocal Pedagogies for Urban Equality. And in this panel, we'll shift scales slightly. I think so far we've been talking about many different aspects of urban equality, but now we'll step back a little bit and really ask the question about how we learn about urban equality, how we learn our cities, and how we learn about equality. We are very lucky to have a very diverse set of perspectives in this panel from the community, from universities, from networks. So I'll start by introducing all our panelists. First will be Professor Kombe. There's a slight change in the schedule. From Adi University in Tanzania, who's been at the forefront of several pedagogic interventions in the East African context. Then we are very lucky to be joined by Anand Lakhan, who is a housing rights activist from the city of Indore and also a fellow of practice at IIHS, who will be joined by Gautam Bhan from IIHS. Followed after that would be Adriana Allen and Julia Wiesli from UCL. And finally, we'll conclude with Colin from Durham University, who will sort of step back and take a slightly more conceptual take on the panel. And then we have a discussant, Brenda Perez Castro, who's actually Colombian but working at ACHR right now, and she'll be sharing some of her perspectives from comparison across those contexts. So I will hand over to Professor Kombe first.
Colleagues, good afternoon. I hope we had a nice lunch. What I'm going to present to you or discuss with you essentially is to share my experience and experience of my institution in terms of trying to provide education to planners and trying to transform planning in some way in the region. And I'll try to explain a few things, but I'll focus on the areas where we have made some inroads and areas where we have not, and the challenges ahead. But in terms of my institution, I would say that it's an old institution which was established way back in the mid-1950s. In the 70s, it was transformed into initially it was a survey school of some kind, training technician for survey, land survey. And then the 70s it became a polytechnic, training town planners, surveyors, land valuers and managers, environmentalists, and. Late in the mid-1990s, 1996 essentially, it was constituted as a college of the University of Dar es Salaam, the mother university of the country, which was established way back in the 1963-60 after independence. Therefore, we were transformed into a university college under the University of Dar es Salaam, essentially trying to build it into a university of its own. And 2006, it became an autonomous university. Therefore, in terms of the delivery of programs and the training, it has a long history, but also at the same time, it has been these changes which took place institutionally were also transformed in the academic training in terms of changing the courses, in terms of diversifying the direction and focus of training. I would make two statements in that regard. One is that when it was a polytechnic, it was essentially focusing on hands-on training, trying to produce persons who are technically competent and able to deliver plans, to prepare plans, and to kind of prepare the plans. Both general plan schemes, detailed plan schemes. When we transformed into a university, it became a combination of preparing plans, engaging in research, and boosting up the critical thinking in terms of identifying the correct perspectives in terms of delivering planning which can make a change. This has continued over years, and many other structural changes have taken place in between in terms of the weight of the practice and weight in terms of theory. This is essentially what has happened in the history. In terms of what I'm now going to discuss to you, because that history is not as interesting as what we are going to discuss in terms of where we've been. I'll largely look into in terms of the training philosophy, and then go a bit on the opportunities, what is going wrong, what is going right, and what not. In terms of the training philosophy, since from the beginning it was essentially hands-on, and then in the mid-90s it became a combination, in which case, but we have retained very strongly the hands-on approach, meaning that training of planners and teaching combines the practice and theory. And theory is taught essentially as it applies to practice or as it relates to practice. This is one of the major features. And this is, it traces its history from the Scandinavian model of training planners and architects. And that's why initially, even the training was essentially a kind of combination between architects and planners. Because when the school started from the 70s, it was being funded essentially by World Bank and Danida, essentially Danish government. And therefore, this strong hands-on approach has been knitted in the process for many years. The only challenge came in the 90s, when then theories have to play a stronger role, and critical thinking and research has also to be taken into account, both in terms of the teaching staff and students. And the approach to projects become more research analytical approach than a hands-on approach. And I want to emphasize that in terms of the uniqueness of our training program, is strong practice oriented, which combine real life exercises from the local communities and studio, comprehensive training, that our BSc program essentially combines majoring in planning, spatial planning, but students have to go through survey training. They can do their cadastral survey to prepare a base map. They have to do architectural work. They start from a housing design up to a master plan level. They also undertake engineering design, roads, water supply, and whatnot. And they should be able to make environmental aspect analysis, including provision of services and such things. Therefore, relatively, we do not have very mono focus on the planning per se, but the base courses are very much intended to provide a student who is capable of working in a very strong multidisciplinary approach. Also, the focus, just a minute, focus is also on the local African context. We do not very much go into the external. I've been exposed some of the programs in South Africa, in Nairobi, in Uganda, and other places. There are quite external oriented programs in terms of theory, in terms of exercises, in terms of supporting subjects, especially South Africa for that matter. Focus, increasing policy influence in the local and regional context, very much. Tanzania, Ardhi Institute has become, or Ardhi University played a very big role, and has played a very big in terms of providing training and training planners for the region. And finally, students are involved in community outreach. We have a rich community outreach where students also. These are very unique features which I have not been able to localize very much in the region where I've been examining. What has worked in terms of these programs? Policy shift has been not swiftly adapted. There are many cases where we've done a good job, including preparation of several government policies, and government uses a lot of staff for this purpose at RD, but this action on this policy is limited. Governance challenges, increasing centralization in the country vis-a-vis decentralization, and therefore absorption of academic ideas becoming difficult. Research and planning knowledge generation quite limited in terms of multidisciplinary approach. We have a lot of multidisciplinary approach in training students. But when it comes to staff working together as a multidisciplinary team in research, that concern planning, that's very weak. And still classical theories of planning and related subjects are still very dominant in our training program. Despite all the practice-oriented studio work, localized and inward looking to African context, we still rely extensively on the theories from the West. Pedagogic approaches that have enhanced partnership in terms of collaboration, which we have built with other institutions, with the multinational organization, including cross-disciplinary approach, which is very unique when you compare with other universities in the country, which are running different disciplines or similar discipline. We don't have so much similar discipline, but related discipline. We are more cross-disciplinary in terms of teaching, and therefore we have been able to attract a lot of support. Praxis-oriented has been a very important aspect, which has also won us a lot of support and from the states and especially and external partners, including World Bank and the bilateral organization, many projects. And the central government extensively using ARU at the university in terms of policy development, project design, implementation, and evaluation. That is a place where we have a more or less a monopoly, especially in urban development sector. Has ARU African schools made inroads in decolonizing? Provided training for many countries in the region before they were independent and after independence. And many of these countries have now established their own schools. And this has been a very important aspect for us in terms of regional influence and regional attachment. We have been very successful in terms of plan education having a strong African focus. That I would say is a very important aspect also. And the countries where we have supported include Zambia, Lesotho, South Africa, Malawi, Namibia, Botswana, Uganda, Kenya, the Gambia, etc. Exported the planning curricula to some of these countries. They have selectively picked some aspect from the course, and that's why I say our course still is very conservative in terms of combinations, and whereas other schools have started to take leaner approach to the programs. Affirmative policy towards informality in our country. Since the 1980s, Tanzania did adopt informality as a public policy and therefore consider it as a model operandi of urban development. This is a very unique in the region. Compare Zimbabwe, South Africa, Kenya until very late in the 19 when they have the new planning law. They were all, informality was considered an acceptable phenomenon in the urban development. But we have had it. Things have changed in these countries, we know it, and I think they have really increasingly adapted. Several of other, informality has been adapted as a model in many other countries in the region. Next, please. Modest contribution. By all measures and indicators, we are saying that 40 years after establishment of the institution, our achievements are very modest, especially when you look back with we train a lot of planners in the region, influence a lot of planning schools and their end plans. But the impact of this planning in urban development remain limited. Essentially because the politicization of the planning system and successes, what we call success in planning, has been highly politicized. Little regard for ethics among graduates, lack of openness, disregard of principle of subsidiarity in decision-making processes, both in the public sector and among colleagues. Theorization requires internal reflection, critical external analysis. We have not been able to do this adequately to be able to see what is the appropriate theory that can blend with our reality and that can explain and exploit our reality in the region. Next. Oh, sorry. Varanbe. Huh? Yeah. I'm making my conclusion by asking questions rather than providing answers. And I'm saying, why does the gap between planning and actual development persist in most sub-Saharan African countries despite increasing establishment of planning schools, planning department, and strong orientation towards praxis? Can urban planning system and practice that are increasingly politicized and influenced by theories and norms and values from global north address priority and local needs of the communities? Are the withering public-led planning, which is typical in many countries in the region, planning systems, and booming community-based led processes, as we've heard here already, part of the solution or problem in search for responsive planning, education, and practice in the global south? Can we achieve urban inequality and in a weakened state environment? And finally, why have planning schools failed to decolonize planning education and training in Africa? Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Our presentation will be in two parts. I'll take the first 5 minutes to lay out IHS's program of the Fellows of Practice, and then one of our Fellows of Practice, Anand Lakhan, will speak, and he will speak somewhere, he tells me, between Hindi and English, and I will translate somewhere between English and Hindi. So the IHS Fellows of Program, and I think I want to mark that it's a very important day to have this conversation about universities, because this week marks the 4-year anniversary of the suicide of Rohit Vemula, a Dalit student at Hyderabad Central University, which in modern, at least in the contemporary Indian historical moment, was one of the flashpoints for really understanding universities and spaces of higher education equally as spaces of humiliation as of progress, and of spaces of very deep violence. But it also made a moment of calling out higher education not as a simple narrative of progress, but actually a deeply conflicted and dual experience for many, precisely at moments of social mobility. So I think our presentation is actually a reflection on the university and its possibilities of holding different forms of training, teaching, and community practice. The Fellows of Practice program at IHS is 4 years old, and it was built to answer two specific questions. The first was, what actually can hold lives of activism? So it is all very well for us to think about many people who live their lives fighting political battles. The question is, what sustains them? Our salaries at the university sustain us. What and who sustains activists? And I think this is a question that has become particularly important, as both the previous answers to this question, which were social movements and then the NGOs, have increasingly strained in order to actually sustain and support lives of activism. The second question for us as a university was, what would it take to make professionals and practitioners we were training take activism seriously as a field of practice, not just as political work one does outside one's professional work, but to take it as a career in urban practice that had its rigors, its strategies, its trainings, and the political economy of its absence of salary and economic household mobility. So the answer to these two questions for us is an experiment. It's an ongoing experiment. We have 3 Fellows of Practice. Abdul Shakil, a housing rights activist based in Delhi, who has used his time to build a residents anti-eviction federation. Isaac Arul Selva, who's sitting on the back by the door over there, who is a housing and Dalit rights activist based in Bangalore, and Anand Lakhan, who is based out of Indore, who we'll hear from. I want to lay out very briefly 4 key parameters that I think mark a university activist collaboration, particularly through the construction of a Fellows of Practice that doesn't just take the university to communities, but brings activists into the university as faculty. The Fellows of Practice are, for our students and for our institution, faculty. And I think that that indication is, to me, the first point I want to make, is that I think that in a lot of discussions about community-university partnerships, we emphasize the word partnership, and I think that's important. But I want to put on the table my first provocation is that we must actually create conditions for shared authority. And shared authority is not the same thing as shared responsibility or shared partnership. So the naming of the Fellows of Practice as faculty for us is really important, because it means our students perceive them not as residents and community members or fellow citizens, they perceive them as people who hold institutional power as faculty. This power matters. It means that someone like Selva is jury for our field studio, in which neighborhoods that he has lived in and grown up in are part of what is being studied in the studio. It means that Fellows of Practice and community activists in the university context give marks, grades, and course evaluations to students as part of their formal education. And I think that while in many ways grading and assessment is a minor part of the way authority is played out, in other ways it's a deeply major part of how authority is understood in the logics of formal institutions of higher education. The second thing that's really important in the teaching of master classes to students that emphasize professional career choices, the Fellows of Practice tell students what it means to make a career as an activist. So the question that's answered is not just what do activists do, it's how do you become one. and using their biographies, and these are students who are meeting multiple practitioners of different kinds in these master classes. So they're meeting professional planners, they're meeting members of the government, they're meeting private sector, they're meeting social activists, each of which is set up in our attempt to be presented as equivalently powerful ways of making a professional life in what is a terminal degree professional program. The second point I wanted to keep is that a structure in faculties of practice in university has to ensure autonomy, because a full incorporation of an activist into an institution curtails the political freedom of that activist. Some of it is very simple institutional risk. It's hard to get arrested, fighting a police eviction, and then have to explain it to your boss. It is much easier when you need to be, you can be free from the institution, and when you need to be, you can belong to the institution. That autonomy has to be structured. And its politics is the politics of the contract of employment. And it's not actually just a question of what are our sensibilities, it's how do you structure an employment contract that protects fellows of practice and gives them labor rights, but gives them enough autonomy to be able to shape political practice without institutional constraint. The third point I want to put is the point of reciprocation, and I think the point of reciprocation is both in about both parties benefiting from the partnership, but I want to combine my point on reciprocation with the point on authority, which is to say that that relationship then cannot just be that both sides learn, it's that both sides are able to direct learning. And an example of this is many of you heard our colleague Mevadi from the Rajasthan Domestic Workers Union yesterday talking about our shared research. But the point in the partnership would be that the second project we're doing with the same union is a project the union commissioned of IHS, was not a research study the university took to community. So for us, a to use Karen's term, a Karen, what's the term? Reciprocal recognition, that one, not Ratin's R, but Karen's R, is to think about the ability of that reciprocation to also allow both partners to set the agenda, to decide the research question, to decide what research happens, is to be able to commission, not just to participate. So it is a reciprocation with authority. And my final point is about sustainability. One of our lessons has been in the last 4 years is that if a Fellows of Practice program thinks about the university activist collaboration as bounded by specific projects that are linked to specific funding, then that is not a relationship that can sustain in any institutional manner. That is then the deliverable of project-bound outputs. Now, it would be naive for any institution anywhere in the world, no matter how resource-rich or resource-poor, to not be upfront about how challenging this constraint is. Funding and projects come from time-bound, output-driven projects. So how do you protect your relationship to not be limited to the project? The IHS Fellows of Practice and their employment contract are not bound to project deliverables. They are not bound to any outputs at all. Okay? Now, this is a radical employment contract structure, which of course is open to the absolutely correct accusation that they're in fact held less accountable to the institution than any of us who are full-time faculty. Okay? So as Anand says, you don't get not to teach, but I get not to show up. Okay? So I think that this is an experiment that we keep debating and that we keep thinking about, because that itself is not a sustainable form for an institution. So I don't have an answer to this last question. All I know is what we can't let it become, which is project-driven participation for the period of the project. But it is hard in some ways, and I'll invite Anand to reflect on how our engagement then does not get reduced to specific projects, or at least thinks about a link of a long-term set of projects. So in closing, my suggestion is that we think very particularly about these 4 connected ways to assess this relation: authority, autonomy, reciprocation, and sustainability. And I'll leave it to Anand.
Thank you, Gautam. And IHS also for giving space to so-called activists. I called myself as a so-called activist. So thank you. Now, this is a tough time for you people. Basically, I'm going to speak in Hindi, and because my feelings will not come in English as I work in my field. So please tolerate me. Gautam is going to translate everything. Namaskar, good afternoon, Jindabad and Jai Bhim. I think this last 2, if you are going to repeat behind me, this is a crime in India at this time. So be careful. और when we are talking about universities, relationship with the universities of activists of the communities, अभी हम इग्नोर नहीं कर सकते हैं जो इस देश में चल रहा है. अभी आप यूनिवर्सिटीज देखेंगे, जेएनयू को देखेंगे आप, सॉरी कई लोगों के फेसेस देख रहा हूं, उनको लग रहा है यार ये क्या बोल रहा है. गौतम आप प्लीज पूरा कर देना है ना. तो बीएचयू है, एमयू है, बीएचयू नहीं, एमयू है, जेएनयू है, जामिया है, और भी यूनिवर्सिटीज है जहां का एक अलग सीन है. पर वो सीन भी जरूरी है जहां पर स्टूडेंट्स उस वॉइस को रेस करने के लिए आगे आ रहे हैं. उनका एक इनबिल्ट सिस्टम है जहां पर अभी एक बड़ा बड़ा जबरदस्त लगता है जब मुझे कुछ स्टूडेंट्स मिलते हैं और वो कहते हैं कि हमने काश जेएनयू में पढ़ा होता. उनको अभी जेएनयू अट्रैक्ट कर रहा है. कुछ एक कैटेगरी ऐसी होगी जो जेएनयू को टुकड़े टुकड़े गैंग बोलती है, लेकिन एक बहुत बड़ा तबका ऐसा भी है जो जेएनयू में जाने के लिए बहुत बेताब है.
So Anand is saying that that there is not a way to talk about the university activist partnership at a time when the politics of the university itself is forefronted, and he's naming several Indian universities that have been the target of violence. Recently, Jamia in Delhi, JNU, Aligarh Muslim University, and he's saying that the students that are in systems of formal education have an inbuilt system, to use his word. Right? There is a setup already from which political expression and action can take place. And the violence that has happened at JNU, while being difficult, has both attracted a certain set of students to JNU, wanting to be part of that system, at least wanting to be within it, wanting to be in the fight in one sense, right? But that is a system that exists because of the university structure that exists. I'm not translating to Tukde Gang right now.
यहाँ हम लोग जो बेसिकली आज मैं जो बात करने बैठा हूँ वो ये है कि अलायंस, नेक्सस, कोलैबोरेशन, आप जो चाहे वो बोल दें, कम्युनिटी एक्टिविस्ट और यूनिवर्सिटीज को लेके. और जो हमारा मकसद था और कम्युनिटी का मकसद था, आई एम नॉट हियर एज आनंद, मैं यहाँ पर कम्युनिटी के रिप्रेजेंटेटिव के तौर पे हूँ क्योंकि मैं कम्युनिटी में ही बिलीव करता हूँ, मैं इंडिविजुअल अपने आनंद में बिलीव नहीं करता. तो बेसिकली यहां हमारा ये था कि ये जो नेक्सस अलायंस जो ये बिल्ट हुआ है, जो कोलैबोरेशन बिल्ट हुआ है, बेसिकली नॉट ओनली फॉर देयर हाउसिंग राइट्स, उसको इंश्योर करने के लिए, बल्कि सस्टेनेबल सिटीज, जस्ट सिटीज, बैलेंस सिटीज, लिवेबल सिटीज. बिकॉज ये चारों शहर का बहुत जरूरत है. जब हिंदुस्तान में, जब इंडिया में स्मार्ट सिटी ऐसा कॉन्सेप्ट आ रहा है जो कि सिर्फ 8 to 10% लोगों के लिए होता है.
So it can't be that he says whatever you call this world between the university, the community, and the activists, whether you call it an alliance, a nexus, or a collaboration, I'm here to talk about as a representative of the community, not as myself, because I believe in the community and not in Anand, me the person. But this collaboration for me is not to ensure the housing rights of the community. It's actually to ensure something much bigger. It's about just cities, sustainable cities, or cities, livable cities, inclusive cities, right? Because these concept paradigms at this scale, like smart cities, etc., these are the things that are coming upon our community. So it's not just about ensuring housing rights. That's not the collaboration.
मेजर जो मोटो था, जो कम्युनिटी के साथ में बैठ के जो निकल कर आया था, वो था हम लोग बहुत सालों से लड़ रहे हैं एविक्शन के अगेंस्ट में. अभी आज सुबह से जो प्रेजेंटेशन हुआ था, एंटी एविक्शन को लेके बहुत मेरे ख्याल से नई बात हुआ, कास्ट डायनामिक्स को लेके नई बात हुआ, लैंड ग्रैबिंग को लेके नई बात हुआ. हम सीधे बात कर रहे हैं कंस्ट्रक्शन का. हम किस तरफ खड़े हैं, हमको वो चीज को इग्नोर नहीं करना होगा, एविक्शन को, लैंड ग्रैबिंग को, और एटलीस्ट कास्ट डायनामिक्स को.
Since the morning, we've been fighting against eviction for many years. And since the morning, I haven't heard conversation about land grabbing. I haven't heard conversations about preventing demolitions. I have not heard anti-caste politics and caste dynamics. For us, we can't sidestep precisely these central issues that form the politics of community mobilization and the community's intentions.
जो मेन निकल कर आया था कम्युनिटी के साथ, हम लोग बहुत सालों से फाइट कर रहे थे एविक्शन के अगेंस्ट में, खासकर ब्रूटल एविक्शन, इलीगल एविक्शन, इन सब के अगेंस्ट में. तो हमें लगा कि व्हाई शुड वी वेट फॉर बुलडोजर टू कम एट आवर डोर, व्हाई शुड वी वेट फॉर द नोटिस टू बी सर्व टू अस टू एविक्ट द प्लेस. इंस्टेड ऑफ वेटिंग फॉर दोज थिंग्स, वी शुड प्लान फॉर सम प्री एविक्शन स्ट्रेटेजी सो दैट दिस थिंग शुड नॉट बी हैपन विद अस. So just because of this pre-eviction strategy, we started collaboration. हम थोड़ा लालची थे, हमको लगा यहाँ पर टेक्निकल एक्सपर्ट्स बैठे हैं, IHS में बहुत अच्छे लोग बैठे हैं जो टेक्निकली बहुत एक्सपर्ट्स हैं, तो हमको लगा कि इनके साथ एक अलायंस बनना चाहिए और हमने प्री इविक्शन स्ट्रेटेजी को लेकर ध्यान में रखा। जब इस देश के दूसरे स्टेट्स पट्टा एक्ट की बात कर रहे हैं, लीज होल्ड राइट्स लाइसेंस्ड फॉर सर्टेन टाइम ऑफ पीरियड फॉर द पर्टिकुलर लैंड, वो एक उसकी बात कर रहे हैं। मध्य प्रदेश हैज ऑलरेडी इंट्रोड्यूस्ड पट्टा एक्ट इन 1984 फॉर द अर्बन पुअर रेसिडेंशियल पर्पस। तो हम लोगों को लगा कि अब हमको जाकर बियॉन्ड पट्टा बात करना होगी, वी शुड स्पीक अबाउट द रजिस्ट्री ऑफ द लैंड। और बहुत सारे स्टेट है जहां पर अभी पट्टे को लेकर चल रहा है, वो पट्टा इज नॉट अ सॉल्यूशन। सॉल्यूशन होगा रजिस्ट्री, सॉल्यूशन होगा इसका अगर लोगों को रजिस्ट्री मिला। तो इसको लेकर हमारा इनके साथ था कि हम कैसे इस चीज को लेकर आगे जाएंगे।
So the connection was that for the pre-eviction strategy, the idea was that he said we got greedy, we were greedy, and we thought that IHS is full of all these technical experts and all these nice people, so we'll go make an alliance with them so that we can start moving on. Said many people have talked about the leasehold, the license as a tenure form in housing precarity. The state of Madhya Pradesh, where Indore is, has had Leasehold Right Act since 1984. And we want to go beyond the leasehold. And the local colloquial word that's used is registry, which is a firmer, closer to full title option. And to them, patta is not a solution. And therefore, the question was, how does one move from leaseholds into more secure, long-term, title-based, land rights-based systems?
ये सिर्फ एक वन साइड नहीं है, इट्स अ टू वे बेसिकली। If I am speaking about the community, so we are with IHS just because we need a transformation of a technical expertise. We need each and every community member should know about the urban planning, about the master plan, about the dynamics of land, about the land politics. And on the student side, अगर मैं बात करता हूँ यूनिवर्सिटी की, तो मुझे लगता है कि transformation of ground realities, they doesn't know about the ground realities, what is happening at the ground, क्योंकि ये सब लोग बड़ा कॉलेज से आते हैं, मुझे ऐसा लगता है, सॉरी, तो नहीं जानते हैं कई चीजें, लेकिन वो फीलिंग्स, वो पेन को ट्रांसफॉर्मेशन, अकाउंटेबिलिटी, सॉरी गीतिका, अकाउंटेबिलिटी कि उनका एक अकाउंटेबिलिटी है टुवर्ड्स द कम्युनिटी, टुवर्ड्स द वर्कफोर्स, जो एक बहुत बड़ा तबका होता है जिससे पूरा शहर चलता है। तो बेसिकली ये बोथ साइड से लर्निंग है, अकेला वी आर नॉट गेनिंग, universities and students are also getting something nahi, more than something from our people, from the community.
So he says the relationship for us is two-sided. What we need is we want every resident of every community to know the full extent of the technical details of this transformation. They need to understand the master plan. They need to understand land law. They need to understand land politics and transformation dynamics, right? And that technical expertise is why we wanted to be in the alliance, and we wanted that knowledge to spread. On the other hand, what we give to the students is that many of them who come from big colleges, who don't know what's happening on the ground, are folks that need to know what actually happens. They also need to know the feeling of transformation, the feeling of what this is like, and that introduces the word Anant is using, gives a sense of accountability to those students. So in my opinion, it's not just a one way of what we get from the university. The university also gets something. No, the university gets more than something from us as well.
यूनिवर्सिटी में रिसर्च होते हैं, लेकिन वो रिसर्च जैसे अभी आज बहुत सारा पेपर सॉरी प्रेजेंट हुआ, मुझे नहीं मालूम वो कम्युनिटी तक कितना पहुंचता है, सॉरी। अगर हमारा रिसर्च है और जिन लोगों के लिए है, अगर उन तक वो नहीं पहुंचेगा तो फिर उसका कोई रिलेवेंसी नहीं है, वो रिलेवेंट नहीं है। फिर वो एक बंद कमरे में आईएचएस के अंदर एक बहुत अच्छा कमरा जहां पर एक लंच बहुत अच्छा हो जाता है, उसके बाद वो चले जाएगा, लेकिन वो लोगों तक नहीं पहुंच पाएगा। तो वो रिसर्च जिनके लिए हुआ है वो लोगों तक पहुंचना चाहिए और एटलीस्ट उनके लिए उनके द्वारा डिजाइन होना चाहिए। आईएचएस के साथ में जो नो प्रोजेक्ट में हम लोग चल रहे हैं, मैं इसको खत्म करूंगा, एक साथ करूंगा। नो प्रोजेक्ट में जो हम लोग चल रहे हैं उसमें बहुत क्लियर है कि लोगों को इन्वॉल्व करे बिना हमारा कोई सा भी स्टडी नहीं हो रहा। इवन हमारा ट्रेनिंग हो रहा है तो सिलेबस उसी वक्त डिसाइड होता है, नेक्स्ट ट्रेनिंग में हम लोग क्या करेंगे, लोगों के साथ इंटरेक्ट करने के बाद में डिसाइड होता है। यह डिसाइड नहीं होता है कि 10 साल पुराना एक सिस्टम लाके डाल दिया। तो ये एक बहुत अच्छा सा एक लोगों के साथ चल रहा है और इसको लेकर लोगों को हम लोग कोशिश कर रहे हैं कि लोगों को इतना सेल्फ सस्टेन बनाए, लोगों को इतना ज्यादा स्ट्रांग करें। जो सुबह बात चल रहा था कि गवर्नमेंट का प्रोसेस है, वी शुड ट्राई टू पुट पीपल इनटू दैट प्रोसेस। मेरा यह है कि शायद बहुत बड़ा ड्रीम देख रहा हूं कि नो प्रोजेक्ट में ऐसा होगा कि जब लोग इतने ज्यादा स्ट्रांग हो जाएंगे, इतने टेक्निकली स्ट्रांग हो जाएंगे, इतना डायनामिक्स को समझेंगे कि वो खुद अपने पॉलिसीज को बनाएंगे, अपने खुद बिल्स को बनाएंगे, तो गवर्नमेंट इज गोइंग टू ट्राई टू एंटर इनटू द पीपल्स प्रोसेस. ये ऐसा जिस दिन होगा उस दिन शायद हम लोग बहुत सारा कुछ चीजों को गेन कर पाएंगे और एक सही पिक्चर हम लोग दिखा पाएंगे.
So, Anand's closing point is that the research that happens in universities cannot be relevant if it does not reach the people that it is meant for and it is about. And so you can sit in a room like this where the air is clean and the food is good, and that is, and he calls it a band kamra, he calls it a closed room, right? And to say that that research has to get to the people, otherwise it is not relevant research. And in the project that we have been working together as part of No, as part of our collaboration, which I should also say, apropos my earlier point, our collaboration has No, is beyond No, is within the project and not rooted to the project, just connecting. So, and that the idea that there is that the way we're doing it is that the curriculum, the work we're doing is jointly decided between us, the community, and people, including the training program. So at this point, we are doing a series of training program on master planning, technical urban transformation, land politics, and housing property rights in Indore over the next 3 months. We have students who are part of designing the curriculum as part of their education. So it's part of their teaching course here. We have faculty that are involved. And Anand saying all of that syllabus is decided together. All of it is decided at the workshop. All of it is decided in a process with what people want. None of the syllabus gets decided here using a 10-year-old system that is then come and taught. So the syllabus is co-produced. I'm using my word in English, not his word. And that in many ways, Heath says that it's going really well. And he says that the point from his direction is that we have to get these trainings have to go on until people become so self-sufficient, so strong, that it's not like he heard in one of the morning papers, people have to contribute and input and shape government plans. Is that people have to be strong enough to write their own policies, to write their own programs, and it will be the government that will have to come and participate and enter into people's policies, not us putting themselves into government plans. And that's the horizon that he wants. And I know him, so I know he has something more to say right now. And I know he's going to do it.
I'm going to share one more thing. कि students हमसे क्या लेते हैं?
That's a trick.
That's the trick.
Students हमसे क्या लेते हैं? एक student थी ऊहा, जो जिसने भोपाल से SPA से उसने अपना स्टडी पूरा किया था. Then she came here. उसने यहाँ अपना स्टडी किया. फिर मरीना पीछे बैठी है. वो युवा में उसने ज्वाइन किया. युवा से फिर वो इंदौर आई थी और उसने हमारे साथ काम किया. हमारे पास बहुत सारा इंफॉर्मेशन था, लोगों के पास बहुत सारा इंफॉर्मेशन था. जो नवनिर्माण मंच है, जो कि एक कम्युनिटी का ग्रुप, कम्युनिटी का एक फेडरेशन है स्टेट लेवल का, स्लम का, उनके पास वो सारा मटेरियल था. उहा ने जब मुझे बोला तो हमको लगा कि हमारा कंट्रीब्यूशन बहुत होता है. जब कोई रिसर्च होता है, कोई स्टडी होता है, किसी का नाम होता है, तो उसमें उहा ने जब बोला कि मैंने अपनी लाइफ में इतना इंफॉर्मेशन कहीं नहीं देखा, और शायद मैंने अर्बन पॉवर्टी इश्यूज में स्पेशली हाउसिंग को लेकर जब मैंने बात किया, तो जितना आई ग्रैब फ्रॉम इंदौर, फ्रॉम यू पीपल, उतना मैंने कहीं से नहीं लिया. मैं बिल्कुल शौक दूं कि इतना इंफॉर्मेशन कहां कैसे मिलता है. ये हमको हमारे सिलेबस में नहीं मिलता है. थैंक यू.
So Anand was talking about one of our alumni from a batch, not this one, whose name was Uha, who had worked with us and worked with Anand during her course, then went to Indore to work with them on a study on eviction, and basically said, working with Yuva, and you will hear Marina and colleagues present later in the day, and in that project on researching urban evictions, that she said that she had never come across an archive of information, of data, of the kind that the community already held, right? And I think it's important because so much of our conversation around Southern urban practice is about working in context of deep data uncertainty. And here is a space actually of full data richness. It's just not data where you look to see it. And so he said that she said to him that she had never felt that she had gained so much knowledge. And for him, that's the things that students, definitely students and practitioners take when working in the community, and that's all he has to say, he says. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Com. Yeah, to the Latin American case now.
Yeah, it does. We have, yes? Okay. Okay, Shaz, thank you so much. Just to add another sort of twist into the discussion, and hopefully you will see that we really tried to put together very different ingredients to provoke a rich discussion. What Julia and I are going to do is to share some work in progress, and we are in search of the generative side of different pedagogies. So we are trying not to talk about transformative because we use transformative in many ways, but basically we are trying to understand if different bets about the way we go about learning the city to activate capacities to change it, to tackle, to challenge conditions of urban inequality, generate a before and after. Yeah? Generate a change before and after. And the focus of our reflection is a network as a school. So it's a different animal from what we have seen so far. We are not talking about... It's not good? Okay, shall I use that? Yeah, I thought so. Thank you for letting me know. Is this better? Yes? So what we are doing here is we are not focusing anymore on something that is being nested within a university, within a higher education institution, but in a very different learning environment. And this learning environment is one of quite a complex network. The network is HIC, the Habitat International Coalition, a coalition of which I will say a couple of words in a second, but in particular we're focusing on one part, yeah, or the practice pedagogies of one part of HIC, which is those that have emerged in the context of Latin America. The reason for this is that we were really surprised to find that actually HIC Latin America, or America Latina, is known throughout the region as Escuela de Urbanismo Popular, a school of grassroots urbanism. And that's quite, I mean, it's quite a consistent name. And HIC has existed for over 40 years, and if you name anybody, if you talk about HIC to anybody in the region, they will say, the Escuela de Urbanismo Popular. That's quite a big name, yeah? Quite a big accolade to earn. So in discussions with Lorena Zárate, who is one of the members behind the work that we are going to share, we asked her that. We asked her, why is that? Why is that HIC AL is called Escuela de Urbanismo Popular? And she said, we actually don't know. So we thought, and we found, that it was perhaps quite interesting to set up to do what we call a pedagogic ethnography, in which we try to understand, really immerse in the elements, the assumptions, the practices, the practice pedagogies that make a school of HIC what it is. So, yeah, if you go to the next one. So, I will say a very few things. Yeah, sorry, I go to that? No? That. So, just to give a tiny bit of context, paraphrasing Karen, 2 words about critical pedagogy, not new but significant. In this case, I mean, we have to, the work, the perspective from which we are looking, or we are trying to build this pedagogic ethnography, clearly draws on the field of critical pedagogy. And don't just think about Frey, but think about the amazing contributions that came after him as well, beyond the fathers of critical pedagogy, from many feminist pedagogies, from many post-structuralists like Deleuze, Guattaz, and so on. What is interesting here, in a nutshell, just not to complicate the whole story, is that critical pedagogy clearly challenges us to think beyond what is called the banking system of education. This idea that there is someone that, knowledge is something to be deposited on someone who is empty, yeah, of knowledge. And I don't need to tell you the story, but clearly this sets up a hierarchy of knowledges, a hierarchy of learner and teacher, and so on. Very, very strong power relations, which are very much solidified and commonly practiced in higher education. So a challenge for any of us working in higher education. So this is the context from which we, sorry, yeah, that was all. And the key question that we said to, which one is that? That one? The key question that then we said to look at was then not how we are learning about urban equality, but how we're learning through practice principles of urban equality. And this is quite different. So if I try to give you in a nutshell what are those two key practice principles that really inform the pedagogies that emerge throughout the school, the Escuela de Urbanismo Popular, they have to do with two different ways of relating to the city or claiming urban equality into the city. One is by claiming it through claiming the right to the city, and the other one is by carving spaces for the social production of a city. Two very, very different strategies, one carving, one claiming. Now, one more thing, I keep on going to the, about perhaps a network. For those of you that don't know it, HIC is a coalition, a very, very mixed coalition. It's a coalition of social movements, university think tanks, NGOs, and so on. There are a few members here, and even coalitions within that operates across the world, in principle about 400 members in 120 countries. But in the case of Latin America, I can't see the numbers, but it has about just over 100 members in 17 countries practicing this, forming what is known as this school. Now, again, 2 words about what makes a school. You will hear a bit more, we will get to that. But what gives a school, the name of a school, is the adoption on the working of different pedagogic tactics that call themselves schools. So these schools are schools of radio, radio schools, schools of leadership, schools of democratic practice, schools of neighborhoods, schools, yeah? Completely different. Some are taking or creating a classroom in a particular space, in a particular geographical condition, others in a very political space, and so on, others in a communication space. So this is quite interesting. The variety of pedagogic tactics is enormous. Now, next. Oh, so what we did, we're going to just use 2 minutes to, to take you through that, was to ask, what am I? To ask many people that we have been, am I doing something? No, you are, okay, it's okay. David, okay. We asked the people that we have so far talked to from 4 countries, about 17 interviews.
En el caso de Chile,
we asked, why is it a school? Why call it a school? Yeah, I'm trying to get to that. So here is what they said.
en el caso de Chile y de América Latina también en general, los procesos de formación y las escuelas han sido parte de nuestra construcción y de nuestros movimientos sociales. Son espacios de construcción colectiva, en primer lugar. No creemos que la escuela es un espacio de enseñanza vertical. Entonces, en estos espacios de formación abiertos, horizontales, que buscamos escapar a la instrumentalización política que muchas veces se hace de líderes y dirigentes en estas materias. En general son espacios que se construyen mucho colectivamente, que no busca ni pretende llegar a conocimiento o a un saber único, sino que levantar las distintas miradas sobre un mismo tema, valorar la diferencia, valorar la diversidad de opiniones respecto.
Bueno, creo que el trabajar en el campo del hábitat desde hace mucho nos llevó a la conclusión de que teníamos que hacer una pedagogía dialógica, o sea, es aprender y compartir también tanto con los pobladores como con las autoridades, con otras organizaciones civiles, etcétera, dado que es un problema que no es simplemente una carrera de pedagogos, sino que tienes que aprender a compartir lo que sabes, pero también a escuchar lo que los otros saben.
Escuela, porque consideramos que la escuela no es un espacio físico, sino es un proceso formativo. Entonces, tomando distancia, digamos, con la escuela formal, pues nosotros le llamamos escuela desde otra forma de aprendizaje. y de otra forma de la relación entre educador y educandos. Una relación pues más horizontal, más creativa, de generar confianza, de identificar que los que participan en procesos de formación sí saben, sí conocen, y es nada más buscar las formas en que den a conocer su conocimiento.
Let me just start in the meanwhile. So I think the idea now was to go from the question of like why a school, to really understand what the different pedagogic strategies are that the members of PIC are employing to actually fill that concept. And so what I want to present you with are 3 different kinds of strategies, which is not intended to be neither comprehensive nor a set typology. This is all emergent, obviously. But it's really about digging in and understanding who are the learners, what is the environment in which that kind of school emerged from, what is the intent the school has in terms of its practice and what it wants to achieve, and what are the actual outcomes. So the first case was happening in Mexico, or is ongoing, and it came about from NGOs being involved in post-disaster reconstruction after earthquakes. The interesting precedence from that was that there was a clear definition of how risk is being constructed in that area. So very much linking to the panel yesterday, in the sense that authorities were giving a particular amount of money very delayed to communities to say okay, first you destroy your house, and instead of the 70 square meter, we give you enough money to maybe buy some or build something that has 30 square meters and that is absolutely not sustainable, not even in economic sense, and environmental sense, and socially neither. But it was also an opportunity for NGOs because there was a tiny bit of funding to actually engage with communities. And now, so there was a clear vision of the status quo is just not sustainable. I mean, the earthquake images, the impacts were severe. So how to go from A to B, and how to not understand this as a linear progression of we come in, we know what to do, we know how housing should be constructed, but really to work with the communities. And with communities that said oh, if you ask what do you want, they were oh, we want a house built of material. And material being equated with the concrete that was brought from long distances, that was very expensive. So the pedagogy of the whole process started with asking, so what were your adobe houses like? And really progressing from an understanding of well, the people in the community there have their own experiences. They know what the climate of the house is. They know how to build it. They have intergenerational knowledge of where do you source the materials from, with whom do you work together, collectively constructing, and so on and so forth. So this pedagogical process then moved on to going from a question of the household experiences to understanding how the local economy works, the livelihood structures, towards up to questioning, well, if we want to source materials locally, we're talking about reforestation, we're talking about climate change, we're talking about global issues. So inserting yourself in that one. And it was really an understanding of if we want to manage things in an integral manner, it's not about reducing complexity, but it's about learning how to manage complexity. So working with community does not mean simplifying issues to a very segmented way. The next case was about growing together as a community. And very linked to what you just said before in the presentation, of housing shortages, and of really communities saying okay, there was a Mapuche, an indigenous community living in the same space as an NGO called Vecinos Sin Techo, so the ones without housing, who were confronted with a problem at a scale where they said well, it's not about making small adaptations, it's not just about coping, it's not just about learning how to build, construct in a certain way, but it's about transforming us as a community, and that is through creating what they called spaces of interlearning. So really getting together, it's not about the what we do, because the what was a process of participatory design, which happens in many places. But what was generative about it? When we asked, were like, well, on the one hand, they had a very clear vision of the future, and this vision of the future was, for example, displayed through competitions in public spaces. Sorry, I'm just laughing at Ruchika because she told me the time is already up. So I'm going to speed up. So there were a lot of pedagogic tactics that were like very, very small, but they fed into this bigger picture with a very strong forward-looking motion, where also the advocacy in public policy was very strong. And what actually happened was, in the way that they were constructing and building houses, that they had an effect on policy. And then in the end, the policymakers were the ones coming to their community to ask them, how did you do it? So very much also aligned with this, we're going beyond understanding and shaping and advocating for, we're actually doing it. And then, we're becoming a reference point for something. And the final example was from Mexico City and other areas from Mexico, where one NGO was working or started to work on a school for citizenship and government as like one integral part after Mexico started having municipal popular elections. So as soon as in the early 2000s, people were able to elect their mayors. It was not only about an education of either public officials or the people to understand like, oh, I need to know how voting works. I need to know how this works. But it's really a school as a matter of like holistically having engagements. They're meeting for 3 months every Saturday so that a lot of people from the communities can participate. And the impact that they're having in terms of scale is massive. And it's not only about like the NGO sharing knowledge with the communities, but it was then also thinking about like how do we do training of trainers? How do we multiply the emancipatory effects that these pedagogies are having? So for example, people that are participating are becoming part of the faculty, are becoming the learners, are becoming teachers in the first place, starting to design the sessions before they've even participated in them, selected parts of them. So there is certain ways of like flipping the thinking about who is the learner, who is the pedagogue, and what are the strategies that we're employing beyond talking about pedagogies as simple methods.
So, okay. We had no time, no? We leave it. No, we had just some cross reading because, as we said, these were just three out of many more pedagogic strategies. There are many more bricolage. We can find many ways in which groups are going. Perhaps I'm not going to go through everything, but just to say that we would like to get back to the point of what then. So what makes them generative pedagogies? Why to call them generative? And what we found was that there is something in the DNA of these practice pedagogies that makes them generative in relation to the who, in the sense that, for instance, there is clearly an issue of learners becoming pedagogues, and so building reciprocal recognition here. A second key point is on the open curriculum, on the what is, so there is no traveling of knowledge, really. There is the knowledge is the whole idea when you work in a higher education institution very often is that, what is going to be the curriculum, what is the content of what we are teaching. And here the focus is much more on formación de haceres, learning of doings rather than of knowings, of wisdoms and so on. Clearly, there are big differences in the how, and I think that here again it's important to see that the learning community is the curriculum, and that's a completely different concept we can get back to, but the curriculum is not the what, is the learning community. And so you think completely differently. And also that when you think about how, there are multiple possibilities of assembling these pedagogic tactics that we talk about. So we might find that different forms of schools connect together in different ways. The workforce, and I finish here, is quite important, just a final reflection. As you heard from Susanna at the beginning, unlike many formal institutions, formal education institutions, and even self-proclaimed critical pedagogues, in many cases the learning intentions are not even too grand. The learning intentions are also very open to be populated by those who are learning in that space. And I think that that's quite critical because we start the other way around. We start with certain learning intentions, outcomes, objectives, and so on, and we want those to happen. Here, the possibility of even populating and directing those learning outcomes is quite crucial. A final issue then is that what we see is that though the learning processes become inhabited rather than acquired, crucial difference, and also that means that being and living within a network, there is a mobility of capacity. So there is some possibility for translocality more than in other type of pedagogic experiments. We'll come back to that. Sorry for the length. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to be part of the panel. I think what I'm going to say is going to be quite brief, so we'll get to Brenda quickly for some discussing comments, and also a little bit of an outlier in terms of what we've had so far. I think the reason I've been asked to be here is partly because I've written a little bit about translocal learning in the context of urban comparison. And so I'm quite, so I think I'm going to say a little bit about that, about comparison and translocal learning, and hopefully prompts something to think about and something to discuss later. But there's so much to discuss already, so I won't be long, honestly. So I just want to give voice to an issue which I think has been sort of niggling at me a little bit in debates around translocal learning for a while, and especially in relation to the role of comparison in translocal learning of different kinds. And when I'm talking about comparison here, I'm thinking about comparison not just as a method, but as a kind of mode of thinking and learning that focuses in on similarities and differences. So I'm picking up a little bit on, for example, Jenny Robinson's work that many of you here will know, where she talks about comparison both as genetic, where you're looking at recurring and shared attributes across different cities across the world, and comparison as generative, where it's about looking for variation and finding how that variation, how differences, how sometimes quite radical differences between places and ideas provides a basis for generating new kinds of insights, new kinds of conversations. And I think the thing that's been niggling me a little bit is the tendency that I sometimes see to kind of attach to comparison a notion of transparency or a sense of transparency. So comparison is too easily folded, I think, into a clear set of expectations based around deliberation, transparency, and consensus. Even assumptions about sort of shared concerns, shared ideas, shared concepts, shared ways of talking about the world. And sometimes what is lost is maybe some of the attention to excess, difference, and incommensurability in relation to translocal learning. So I guess what I want to talk about is the kind of incomparable that accompanies the notion of comparison when translocal learning takes place, or at least to ask a question and hopefully get us to reflect a little bit about that. And part of my inspiration for this is a recent piece by my friend Tariq Jazeel, who works on Sri Lanka, is based in London at UCL, so many people here at UCL and they will know Tariq. And his kind of arguments recently about what he calls singularity. And what Tariq is interested in when he talks about singularity is those moments in which knowledge, in these kind of translocal encounters, in which knowledge can't be shared, but is nonetheless generated anyway. And it's generated, so what happens is that particular experiences and stories come to stand in for existing concepts, so I got that wrong way around. Existing concepts come to stand in for experiences and stories which aren't being articulated, which aren't being shared as forms of knowledge. He calls this singularity. So for example, his work on Buddhism, which he argues can't, he's written several books about this. He argues that in relation to Buddhism, that a lot of the work he's doing in Sri Lanka can't be reduced to the category of religion. He also draws heavily on, for example, Anna Singh's work, for example, her book Friction, in which she shows how local knowledges around forestry in Indonesia fall out of the frame of kind of commonsensical uses and scientific debates around forestry in Indonesia. So what he's asking, I think, in different kinds of ways, is what comes to stand in when communication fails in translocal learning. So for Tariq, he's asking, what are the fragments of uncommunication, non-communication, through which experience is nonetheless communicated? What is the generative potential of untranslatable non-comparative encounters, of not so much co-production, but co-non-production, a kind of conversation which does something even though the parameters of what's being done is opaque and excessive to the conversation that's taking place. So part of the issue here is not so much to do with the terms of comparison, so for example the power relations between different groups, but instead with the terms that comparison in translocal learning revolves around, the actual terms we're using. So just as an example, over the last couple of days in this conference, I've been writing down some of the shared terms that we often use in the papers and discussions, and some of the terms that keep coming up are, for example, vulnerability, livelihood, risk, resilience, disaster, rights to the city, equality, empowerment, capacity building, mobility, co-production, learning platforms, cooperatives, networks, dialogue, social infrastructure, informality. Like, that's a lot, right? But these terms keep coming up. And there's always a kind of, I've been kind of struck by the kind of sense that we kind of all know sort of what these terms are about. Or at least that's what the kind of impression I get. So some of these shared terms are transparent, and understandings of them are quite stable across all of us. But others, I think, will probably signify quite different things to all of us, which aren't necessarily being foregrounded or articulated. And indeed, some of these categories will be standing in for something else altogether, which isn't being voiced. And some of the different understandings of those terms is clear, others less so. So this is kind of fairly straightforward observation. But this tendency, I think, to use shared terms in ways that sometimes spill over singularities and differences has, of course, been widely reported in other forms of urban research. So, for instance, there's a lot of research on infrastructure, which has shown how the kind of commonplace understanding of infrastructure in certain urban debates took on certain Anglo-American assumptions about what infrastructure is and what its logics and politics are, and that's been disrupted. The same for the category of space, which has been disrupted as well. Just as a kind of as a mode of translocal learning, the point is not so much that urban comparison is limited, but that it is important to be aware of not just the knowledge that is present and shared and explicit, but the knowledge that is absent, the traces, the fragments, the frictions of what exceeds the framings of our conversation. So we focus more, I think, on what common language enables, and that's right, and that's a good thing, how it helps us to make sense of shared problems of each other's work, but think less about what a common language closes off, how we might mean quite different things by some of those shared terms, for instance. In some cases, we might need an alternative language. So, for example, I was really struck this morning by the excellent presentation we had on migrants in the circular economy, and the really interesting argument about not classifying and categorizing the Adivasi workers and instead seeking out heterogeneity. So in their paper, Nivedita, Raghav and Devya's argument, as I saw it, was to even lead them to suggest that the categories of city and migrant ceased to hold any inherent meaning or value in that analysis. And the urban planning and policy has to extend beyond these universal principles to local contingencies and heterogeneities and the logics of the poor. So, for example, inclusion and exclusion became a kind of useless framework, and instead it was much more useful to think about the pragmatic forms of access and use of resources and space that we see amongst circular migrants. Those are some of the arguments that were being made this morning. So part of what I'm getting at here, and I am wrapping up, is the hidden traces and knowledge fragments that accompany comparative translocal learning, and which might even sometimes be casualties of the shared language we use. So this means being guided, I think, by the recognition, as Abdulmalik Simonis put it, of the multiple realities, visible and invisible, which means that the city is always slipping away from us, always somewhere else than where we expect it to be. So the knowledge fragment in the context of comparative learning might then act as a kind of lure, a sort of a lure, a kind of invitation to pause and stay with difference, even as that difference slips away or morphs into some other category, and to ask what is kind of being gained and lost. And I find Teresa Caldeira's description of the juxtaposition of singularities very useful here, because by talking about singularities and juxtaposing singularities, she's trying to, I think, keep a hold of the specificity and differences which get lost in shared conversations across comparative translocal learning. So the challenge here then is perhaps to work with the notion of the urban and the city, which demands a kind of plural, sometimes contradictory position, at a minimum, It demands we think about the relations between shared terms and concepts on the one hand, and the kind of idea that they can access local realities on the other. Sometimes they will access those local realities, and they'll do that really well, those shared concepts, those shared conversations. But what about the non-comparable? What is not traveling in the translocal learning? What does that generate, and what is being lost? So these are just very kind of abstract, more observations than anything else. And I don't know how well they connect with, well, they don't massively well connect, let's be honest, with what we've already heard in this session. But thank you for listening in nonetheless. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. I'll request Brenda now to share her thoughts, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much for these amazing presentations. I should clarify from the beginning that my point of view is that of a practitioner. I don't have much experience in discussing pedagogies specifically, but I believe because of my own personal experience of being a practitioner and an activist who was born and raised in Latin America and who has decided to chase ideas throughout the world, I think I can relate to a lot of what has been said here. And one of the first things that I found striking in all the presentations is that there is this underlying self-criticism in understanding that the university is not fulfilling the role that it should. The university was born as a place in which knowledge should be made to transform realities. And my feeling when listening to all of you is that you're feeling the university is not fulfilling that role. Why is that happening? And what is the base of that criticism? It is perhaps that we believe that knowledge is potentially a base for change and for social change and transformation. And I believe when the university was born, it was based on this idea of creating a knowledge that would lead us into progress. But we're challenging this idea of progress as well. And I think the university is starting to reflect that. I think from Professor Combe all the way to Colin, what we're reflecting on here is how do we break those barriers that we have created that are fake between the university and reality. And I think that there are very interesting cases and explanations on how that can be done. From the university stepping out into the reality and trying to see how that bridge is built, but the other way around as well. From the social movements, which are a school in itself, as he has shown it, and also from the ACHR point of view, this is something that I've heard from activists all around the world. The social movements themselves are a school. And I've been told, why are you thinking of doing a PhD? You shouldn't be doing that because you're doing a PhD just by being here with the communities. And communities do not need a PhD because they have that knowledge and that experience, which is not, maybe not structured and chaotic and maybe difficult to grasp for us, those of us who have a more scientific view of the world. So what I find very interesting is this dialogue between what seems to be two extremes of reality. But I'm seeing very interesting examples of that self-reflection in the case of at the university, because I think you are bringing a very technical point of view, which is land administration, and bringing that down to how can we rethink African cities and how we can decolonize the university. I think that's the very key question underlying all of the presentations, because decolonizing is not about, even for those countries who have not been colonized, it's also thinking on how we break power structures, how we create more horizontal learning, how we value knowledges that are not scientific, that are more based on the artisanship of practices that come from the everyday life and experience of communities themselves. So I think the underlying issue is how to decolonize, how to break these doors that we have created between these rooms, as Anand was pointing out, is we should be connecting with a space beyond this closed room. And in order to break that barrier, we have to go both ways. It's not just occupying the university, but it's also stepping out and understanding how reality works outside. I think there are many other issues that I found super interesting, but I wanted to emphasize on this idea of decolonizing and thinking whether that is enough, because we're discussing urban inequality here. And the question is creating a more comprehensive knowledge, a more inclusive knowledge enough to challenge the very basic structures of inequality, the political economy behind of it? We want to believe it is, because we're all here trying to share knowledge and see how we can challenge that. But is that enough? That would be my provocation as well, because we know there are very strong forces behind inequality that are not just about knowledge. So that would be the question with which I would open up the discussion. But yeah, that would be my main point. Thank you.
To the floor for questions. We'll have one round of questions only because we're running a little bit behind time.
My question is to Anand and Gautam. When you were conceptualizing, so the university, or at least Indian universities, have for some time had a space for practitioners to enter the university and engage in pedagogy, right, and in some way connect. So through the means of visiting faculty or other such instruments. In conceptualizing the Fellows of Practice program, you seem to have deliberately moved away beyond whatever from that paradigm. Could you elaborate a little bit on the thinking behind that and the 4 factors that you mentioned?
Hi, thank you to all the panelists. My question is to Adriana and Julia. Professor Combe spoke about decolonizing planning education, and I just want to ask if you guys have also thought about it in Latin America, and if you can comment on how you think it'll be different in countries of sub-Saharan Africa, which were extractive colonies and are now independent, versus settler colonial countries in Latin America.
Thank you for the presentations. My question is around if you feel in the different pedagogical practices that you've been studying, there has been any epistemic silences because of the nature of the pedagogy that you're implementing. I think I relate a bit of the work from Anand and Gautam, because recently in my own practice, issues of urban violence was clearly avoided in such engagements because of the concerns from community groups of exposing such a complex issue to students that might not be able to navigate it in a way that's safe for everybody around the process.
So I'll answer Manish and Anand will answer Alex. So Manish, the Fellows of Practice program does not need to only be for activists. So it's designed like that, so that will hopefully be the program in the institution. The reason to start with it is purely strategic. It's because the other kinds of professional practitioners have no problem coming in and out of the university, especially urban universities and technical universities. There is the relationship, the long-standing, the projects work, the budgets work, they're designed like that, right? Their CVs make sense, they can be read easily, their compensation packages can be calculated by HR. So we started so that this would become the norm, and then when the professional engineer from L&T came on his contract, he would follow this norm instead of vice versa. It's just strategy. It's got no conceptual. The program should hold all types of practitioners. The idea to start with this is to not risk this form of practice to be left off the table, because the other ones will happily find their way into a place like this. So, yeah.
When we are working since long time with the community, So we raise such type of questions among them, this caste dynamics and all. तो इतना प्रॉब्लम नहीं होता है, क्योंकि अगर आप नए नए काम कर रहे हैं किसी के साथ, लेकिन शायद यही सवाल था.
अगर कभी जो
Yes, sure. जस्ट बिकॉज की कम्युनिटी के साथ में सिर्फ हमारा रिलेशन नहीं होता है, हम उनका रिलेशन भी क्रिएट करते हैं, डेवलप करते हैं. स्टूडेंट्स आर कमिंग फ्रॉम द यूनिवर्सिटीज टू आवर इंस्टीट्यूट और आवर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन. वी ट्राई टू कनेक्ट दो स्टूडेंट्स विद द कम्युनिटी ऑल्सो एंड मेक इजी दैट उनका रिलेशन बहुत अच्छा हो जाए और वो सारे क्वेश्चन इज गोइंग टू एक्सप्लेन यू इन इंग्लिश देन व्हाट आई एम टेलिंग इन हिंदी. तो हम कोशिश वो करते हैं और उसको रेस करते हैं. ऐसा नहीं कि स्टूडेंट के थ्रू रेज नहीं करते हैं. अभी जो अपूर्वा और ये पीछे जो कुछ 4 इंटर्न्स बैठे हैं जो हमारे वहां पर आ रहे हैं, इसके पहले भी बहुत सारे इंटर्न्स आए हैं. तो शायद गीतिका आप भी कुछ लोगों के साथ में रहे हैं. तो ये प्रोसेस चलता है और इसमें लोगों की तरफ से कहीं कुछ मना नहीं होता है, क्योंकि ये क्वेश्चन एक बर्निंग इश्यू है और उसको उनको लेने में कोई परेशानी नहीं होता है.
So Anand saying that the issues that are difficult to raise even in community spaces, right? So issues of violence. He took the example of caste dynamics, which is a good translation of things that can become, And so the question of do you safeguard a pedagogical space from that? So his answer is no. That the work to be done is to build a relationship of the students with the community, in which that topic, those conversations can be brought and held. So the idea is not to retreat from that. But he's also giving the example that it's also because there is a long-standing relationship with other mediators, right? So the faculty and us, we work together all the time. So I think the context also to understand about this is the interactions between the fellows in practice and the faculty here is every day, is not only when we have a project going on in the community. So we work together all the time. So the presence of those mediators means the students can be incorporated in those discussions. He hasn't felt the need of a retreat to not talk about certain kinds of issues.
But if we speak about the present context in India, we can't ignore this saffronism violence which is happening, and most of the slums are being evicted due to this. So we have to put all these things in a system, in a project with our students.
He's saying that particularly in the current political context, something like violence and saffron violence is referring to his understanding of Hindu right violence, can especially not be talked about because it's foundational to the contentions of violence in urban space.
Or Combe, no? You want to? Yeah.
What I just want to say is that I think the issue of transforming planning education particularly and the role of universities is, in my opinion, a bit oversimplified. Oversimplified in the sense that the forces which are shaping universities are very variable, and the institutional and political social environment which is within which university ought and have to operate are very critical concerns. And therefore I think in order to be able to find a room for maneuver especially, it's very important to understand these specific contexts and try to find out entry points, which I see in the case of IHSS. It seems to be working somehow to whatever extent it's been said. But I think the challenge is identifying opportunities where you can enter with change and create a change which can be moved forward in terms of being carried forward by graduates. Because as you rightly put it, graduates are very important resources which can transform and continue selling the idea and sharing the idea and practicing the idea. But I think it's very important that we are able to identify the entry points which is appropriate for specific context. In the sub-Saharan Africa, I think the challenge is even more in that regard.
Just my closing comment to Brenda's question about knowledge and transformation. I think the question that I would ask slightly differently is actually what forms of knowledge in which institutional locations are able to have impact. And I think one of the things that we have learned in different ways is that getting a pulse on the fact that a distributed kind of knowledge with differently placed actors is what seems to have the best chance to have change that is structural in any way. So there is a reason why Anand and I and Selva started working together in a particular way. We worked together before just as housing rights activists. And we were doing what he was saying. We were stopping the bulldozers. But the move to think of a pre-eviction strategy makes that knowledge base insufficient. And it makes the richness of that knowledge base in the communities insufficient. And that's also something that we have to have an honest conversation about. Something I think there is also a reticence to talk about the fact that community knowledge is rich, but it's particular. University knowledge is rich, but it's particular. Right? And I think we're sometimes really afraid to, not everyone doesn't know everything. Right? And it doesn't make, but the reason I think that hesitation comes is because the power relations in the external, the way the external world views those two knowledges is so powerful that when we say, actually, you know this and not this, it feels like you're reinforcing a dominant external evaluation of that power. And that's why in our safe spaces, it took us a long time to get over this fact of saying, if I say I'm better at this than you, that's not a naked exercise of power of different legitimate knowledge. It's just a fact of saying everyone do what they can do best. And I think that there are some structural transformations that only a compact of differently situated actors can do. And I think that the more those networks are able to hold not just, for example, associations of various informal settlement residents that we've all been part of and or networks that are pivotal, but also some that have unlikely and uneasy alliances. Because without those, there are certain kinds of conversations and translations that are not happening. You know, and I think there's a need for all of us to pay particular attention to say, why do certain knowledge transformations make us want new forms of partnerships? Why the reach for a technical expertise of a certain kind? And the answer partly was that for a long time in India, evictions were about political negotiations with the government. And then they became judicial negotiations with the courts. And the knowledge of our social movements, which was so rich in how to fight an elected government, was not powerful in how to fight a court. We could not switch social movement strategies. And therefore, we needed new networks. And they came with good and bad things. There was a joke that every community meeting now had lawyers, right? And lawyers became the new urban activists. And all urban planning education became education about law. Like we all suddenly had to learn the law because and that compact required new knowledge that required new networks. So I think we also have to allow ourselves to take on network formations where there are two actors with very different locations, very different powers, and think about how to have relations that do not hide those power relations, but take them head on and yet create something of value. And I think the last sentence I will say about the university is, I think the tension that I feel in many ways when you look at, especially the public universities of the South, is that in one way, they really do feel like we've come a long way from certain kinds of original purpose. But I think in another way, to me, in India, they remain in many ways one of the most reliable ways for single generation social mobility. And so they are still pivotal in certain kinds of transformation, even as they fail. And, you know, I think so in some ways the question to ask also is, how can we still build their ability to hold that individual social transformation, which residents of the communities we work in go through when they get to university. And in the public university in India, they get there, only in the public university. And so the attack on the public university is also an attack on generational social mobility. It's fundamentally an attack on that more than beyond knowledge production, beyond freedom, all of those are true. But they are also one of the very few places when an individual human gets to feel human in this country. And that's what we risk when we risk not defending the university.
Perhaps just something to close because we are over already, no? But just perhaps a final reflection, no more answers, but I think that I hope that the main takeaway message is not doesn't fit into a dichotomic view of transformative or generative pedagogies, whether you do them from the university, the community, and so on, because I think that the intention was exactly the opposite. I mean, we do what we can from where we are, yeah? And we are far more mixed, as you were saying. I mean, most people that are engaged in some form of interface, if they do it from the university, from an NGO, from a social movement, and so on, usually are traveling, a long way. So I think that we need to perhaps avoid over-criticizing, as you said, the university at the site of change, in the same way that we have to stop from over-romanticizing the community as a site where knowledge is transformative and so on. In all these interfaces that we create, we take risks. We are embedded in political economies in different environments. We try to shake them the best way we can, but they are very, very heavy. There are structural forces around them, and we have to live with that and push slowly the systems. But I think that the main thing is really probably to keep ourselves on our toes. I think that when we took over or for this conversation, it was very much to keep ourselves on our toes from wherever you are practicing as a pedagogue, any form of pedagogy, with whoever you are doing it, on whatever issue, in whatever context. And this is, I think, one of the key messages. We need to be aware that as we do these experimentations, we practice different ways of learning and so on, with the hope that we are going to transform, to tackle, to challenge conditions of urban inequality. Again, inadvertently, we might be reproducing that. And it might be that because of the relations, sadly, we keep on, for instance, even in a networks relations are never flat. Yeah, every relation that we try to create, whether it's an existing on a new network or a new interface, is populated of power relations. Even what we are calling communities are, and so on. So there is no way of escaping the same questions, I would say, about the choices, the silences, the insufficiencies of what we do. I think that the only thing that we can do is to be as explicit as possible with, the provisional way in which we navigate through them. I hope we continue the debate beyond the panel. Thank you. No? You want to? No? You want to? You said no? Okay. Sorry. No, he said, do you want to?
No, it's fine. We're finished.
I thought you had said no. That's why.
No, we have said no.
Oh, okay. Okay.